Welcome to Fright Club. The first rule of Fright Club is you do talk about Fright Club, based on true events. The daguerreotype. From the Journal of Dr. Marcus Blackwood, October 15th, 2024. The morning light filters through the tall windows of my studio with that peculiar quality I have come to cherish, diffused by the perpetual haze of chemical vapors that permeates every corner of this converted warehouse. It is, I confess, an atmosphere that most would find suffocating, yet to me it represents the very essence of authentic artistic pursuit. Here, in this sanctuary of silver and mercury, I practice the purest form of photographic expression known to mankind. The daguerreotype process of Louis-Jacques-Mandé Daguerre himself, unmarred by the vulgar conveniences of modern digital manipulation. Mrs. Eleanor Harrington arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, as befits a woman of her social standing. I observed her through the frosted glass of the studio entrance, a figure of studied elegance, her silver hair arranged in a manner that suggested both wealth and an acute awareness of propriety. She moved with the deliberate grace of one accustomed to being observed, to being judged worthy of observation. Perfect, I thought, for what I had in mind. "Dr. Blackwood," she said upon entering, her voice carrying that distinctive Baltimore accent softened by education and refinement. "I must say, your reputation precedes you. Margaret Whitmore spoke most highly of your unique approach to portraiture." I assisted her with her coat, a garment of obvious quality, cashmere perhaps, the colour of autumn leaves. "Mrs. Harrington, the pleasure is entirely mine. I trust Margaret explained the nature of my process. The daguerreotype is not merely photography, it is an act of revelation, a communion between subject and silver that captures not merely appearance, but essence." She smiled with the practiced ease of one who had spent decades navigating social obligations. She mentioned it was quite different from conventional photography, something about historical authenticity. "Historical authenticity," I repeated, savouring the phrase. "Yes, though that barely scratches the surface of what we accomplish here. Please, allow me to show you the apparatus." I led her through the studio, past the carefully arranged antique furniture I use for staging, toward the camera itself, a magnificent reproduction of a Giroux daguerreotype camera, crafted to the exact specifications of those used in the 1840s. The brass fittings gleamed in the diffused light, and the mahogany body bore the patina of careful use. Beside it stood my collection of chemical baths, each prepared according to formulations I had perfected through years of study and experimentation. "The process," I began, falling into the measured cadences I employ when explaining my craft, "begins with a silver-plated copper sheet, polished to mirror perfection. This plate is then sensitized with iodine vapors, creating a light-sensitive surface that will capture your image with unprecedented clarity and permanence." Mrs. Harrington approached the camera with obvious curiosity, though I detected a slight hesitation in her manner. "And how long must one remain still?" "Ah, that is where modern practitioners often compromise the integrity of the process. The original daguerreotypes required exposures of 15 to 20 minutes. I maintain these standards, for it is during these extended moments of stillness that the silver truly captures not merely your physical form, but something far more profound. I began the preparation ritual, movements I had performed countless times yet, which never failed to fill me with a sense of reverent purpose. First, the silver plate, retrieved from its protective case and examined for any imperfection that might mar the final image. The surface gleamed like liquid mercury, reflecting my face in miniature as I held it to the light. Satisfied with its perfection, I placed it within the iodine box, a sealed chamber where yellow vapors would transform the silver into silver iodide, sensitive to light yet stable in darkness. "The alchemy begins," I murmured, more to myself than to Mrs. Harrington, though I noticed she attended my words with growing fascination. Iodine and silver, combining to create a surface that will hold light itself, trapping photons within its crystalline structure. The chemical processes that follow are perhaps incomprehensible to the uninitiated, yet they represent the culmination of human understanding of light and matter. As the iodine vapors worked their molecular transformation, I prepared the mercury bath. Here, I must admit, I have made certain modifications to the traditional process. Where Daguerre used minimal mercury heating, I have discovered that slightly elevated temperatures, carefully controlled, produce images of extraordinary clarity and depth. The mercury, I explained to Mrs. Harrington as I adjusted the flame beneath the quicksilver, will form an amalgam with the exposed silver particles, creating the actual image. It is a process that requires the utmost precision, too little heat, and the image remains faint. Too much, and the mercury vapors become... I paused, choosing my words carefully. Overwhelming. I had begun to notice, in recent months, a peculiar metallic taste that lingered on my tongue during these preparations. My physician, Dr. Stevens, had suggested it might be related to the chemicals I work with, though I assured him that I take every reasonable precaution. The taste was not unpleasant, merely distinctive, like silver coins held too long in one's mouth. Mrs. Harrington took her position before the camera, with surprising grace for one unfamiliar with the requirements of extended posing. I had arranged the lighting to fall across her features at the optimal angle, casting shadows that would lend depth and character to the final image. Her hands, encased in white kid gloves, rested upon the arms of an antique chair that had served for countless portraits. "The exposure begins now," I announced, removing the lens cap with ceremony. "For the next 20 minutes, you must remain as motionless as possible. Think of yourself as becoming one with the silver itself, eternal, unchanging, captured in a moment that will outlast us both." The studio fell into that peculiar silence that accompanies the daguerreotype process. Unlike modern photography, where images are captured in fractions of seconds, the extended exposure creates an atmosphere of meditation, of reverence. I find myself entering an almost trance-like state during these sessions, my consciousness seeming to merge with the chemical processes occurring within the camera. It was during the 15th minute of Mrs. Harrington's exposure that I experienced one of those episodes that had become increasingly frequent of late. The studio seemed to shimmer, as though the mercury vapors had formed a visible haze between myself and my subject. For a moment, perhaps longer, though time becomes elastic in such states, I found myself studying Mrs. Harrington's hands with unusual intensity. The white gloves appeared different somehow, as though stained with something dark that seemed to seep through the fabric. I blinked, and the sensation passed. The gloves were pristine white once more, her posture unchanged. Yet the image remained vivid in my mind. Those hands, elegant and refined, marked by shadows that suggested, what? Guilt? Corruption? I have learned to trust these impressions, for they often prove prophetic once the daguerreotype is developed. "Time," I announced, replacing the lens cap with steady hands, despite the slight tremor I had recently developed. "The exposure is complete. Now we must allow the silver to tell us what truths it has captured." Mrs. Harrington relaxed with visible relief, flexing her fingers and rotating her shoulders. That was more challenging than I anticipated. Do you find that all your subjects manage to remain so still? Some, I replied, find the process transformative. The extended stillness often induces a state of self-reflection that proves quite revealing. I was already focused on the developing process, my mind anticipating the moment when the silver would yield its secrets. The developing bath had reached optimal temperature, precisely 68 degrees Celsius, hot enough to vaporize the mercury, but not so hot as to create excessive turbulence in the quicksilver. I slid the exposed plate into the mercury chamber, sealing it to prevent contamination. Through the glass viewing port, I could observe the gradual emergence of the image as mercury amalgamated with the exposed silver particles. "How long before we can see the result?" Mrs. Harrington inquired, though I detected an undercurrent of anxiety in her voice that had not been present earlier. "Patience, Mrs. Harrington. The mercury works according to its own schedule, not ours. We must allow the image to emerge naturally without forcing the process." I watched through the viewing glass as shadows began to coalesce into recognizable forms. The curve of her cheek, the elegant lines of her hair, the careful arrangement of her hands. It was those hands that first caught my attention as the image solidified. Where I had posed her with gloves of pristine white, the daguerreotype seemed to show something else entirely. Dark stains spread across the fabric, concentrated around the fingers and palms, as though the gloves had been saturated with some viscous substance. Blood. The thought came unbidden, accompanied by that metallic taste that had become so familiar. "Remarkable," I whispered, leaning closer to the viewing glass. The stains were clearly visible now, though they had certainly not been present during the actual sitting. This was not the first time my daguerreotypes had revealed details invisible to the naked eye during exposure, but never had the revelation been quite so explicit. I removed the plate from the mercury chamber and began the fixing process, immersing it in a solution of sodium thiosulfate to halt further chemical reaction. The image, now permanent, gleamed with that distinctive mirror-like quality that only genuine daguerreotypes possess. And there, unmistakably clear on the silver surface, were Mrs. Harrington's hands, stained with what could only be described as blood. "Is something wrong, Dr. Blackwood?" Mrs. Harrington had approached the developing station, though I maintained the daguerreotype positioned so she could not see its surface. "You seem disturbed." "Not disturbed," I replied carefully, my mind racing with implications. "Fascinated. The daguerreotype has captured something quite extraordinary, details that speak to the remarkable sensitivity of the silver emulsion." I found myself studying Mrs. Harrington's actual hands as she stood before me. The white gloves remained pristine, showing no trace of the stains so clearly visible in the photograph. Yet I could not dismiss what the silver had revealed. In my experience, such manifestations were never without significance. "Might I see the photograph now?" she asked, extending one gloved hand toward the daguerreotype. "I prefer to allow my subjects to view their portraits after I have completed the final polishing and mounting," I replied, carefully placing the plate in its protective case. The silver surface requires delicate handling to maintain its reflective qualities. Mrs. Harrington's expression suggested mild disappointment, though she accepted my explanation with good grace. "Of course. When might I return to see the finished portrait?" 3 days hence should allow sufficient time for proper finishing," I said, though my mind was already occupied with the research I intended to conduct regarding Mrs. Harrington's circumstances. If the daguerreotype had indeed revealed evidence of bloodshed, I felt compelled to understand its significance. After Mrs. Harrington departed, settling her account with the composed efficiency of the wealthy, I found myself alone with the developed plate. Under magnification, the bloodstains were even more pronounced. Not mere shadows or artifacts of the chemical process, but clearly defined marks that suggested recent contact with substantial quantities of blood. I have devoted considerable study to the metaphysical properties of silver and mercury, drawn by historical accounts of daguerreotypes that seem to capture more than mere physical reality. The combination of silver's legendary purity and mercury's alchemical significance creates, I believe, a medium capable of perceiving moral truth, invisible to conventional observation. That evening, as I prepared my notes regarding the session, I found myself compelled to research Mrs. Eleanor Harrington more thoroughly. A simple internet search revealed information that sent a chill through my spirit. Her husband, the prominent attorney Harold Harrington, had died just 3 weeks prior under circumstances that had prompted police investigation. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, though the family had declined to authorize an autopsy. I returned to the daguerreotype, studying it under intense magnification. The bloodstains on the gloves seemed almost to pulse in the lamplight, as though the silver itself were trying to communicate some vital truth. Whatever moral corruption had touched Mrs. Harrington's hands, the daguerreotype had captured it with uncompromising clarity. As I retired that evening, the metallic taste more pronounced than usual, I found myself wondering what other truths might be revealed through my enhanced photographic process. The silver and mercury, properly combined, seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to peer beyond surface appearances into the hidden nature of things. I slept poorly, troubled by dreams of silver mirrors that reflected not physical forms, but the moral essence of all who gazed into them. Upon waking, I discovered my hands trembling slightly, a side effect perhaps of prolonged exposure to the chemical vapors that are the price of authentic artistic achievement. From the Journal of Dr. Marcus Blackwood, October 18th, 2024. 3 days have elapsed since Mrs. Harrington's sitting, and I find myself unable to dismiss the revelations contained within her daguerreotype. Under my most powerful magnifying apparatus, a Zeiss lens of exceptional clarity that I acquired specifically for the detailed analysis of photographic plates, the bloodstains upon her gloves appear with shocking definition. What initially seemed like shadows or chemical artifacts now reveal themselves as unmistakably organic in nature, possessing the distinctive patterns of coagulated blood that has seeped through fabric. I have spent considerable time this morning in contemplation of what this signifies. The daguerreotype process, as I have come to understand through extensive research into its metaphysical properties, operates upon principles that transcend mere photochemistry. Silver, long revered for its purifying qualities and supernatural sensitivity, combines with mercury, that most mercurial of elements, capable of existing in multiple states and long associated with divine revelation, to create a medium that perceives truth in ways the human eye cannot. My investigations into Mrs. Harrington's circumstances have yielded disturbing correlations. The Baltimore Sun's archives, accessible through the university's digital collections, contain a brief obituary for Harold Harrington, dated September 24th. Prominent attorney Harold Harrington, 67, died suddenly at his Roland Park residence. He is survived by his wife Eleanor and 2 children from a previous marriage. Services will be private at the family's request. The terseness of the notice, particularly the emphasis on privacy, suggests circumstances the family prefers to keep from public scrutiny. More illuminating was my discovery of a police report obtained through contacts I maintain from my academic days. Officer Janet Morrison's initial response document notes suspicious circumstances surrounding Mr. Harrington's death, including unusual positioning of the deceased and unexplained traces of blood in the study despite apparent natural causes. The investigating detective, Sarah Morrison, presumably Officer Morrison's daughter or relative, recommended further investigation, though the family's political connections apparently prevented more thorough inquiry. The daguerreotype, it seems, has succeeded where conventional investigation failed. Whatever blood stained Mrs. Harrington's hands during or immediately following her husband's death, the silver emulsion captured its lingering presence despite the apparent cleanliness of her gloves during our session. This revelation has profound implications for my understanding of the photographic process itself. Yesterday afternoon brought my second appointment of the week, Judge Robert Morrison, a man of considerable reputation in Baltimore's legal circles. I confess to feeling a particular anticipation as I prepared for his session, curious whether the daguerreotype would reveal similar moral insights regarding his honor's character. Judge Morrison arrived with the punctuality one expects from the judicial profession. Though I noted immediately a certain nervousness in his demeanor that seemed inconsistent with his professional bearing. He fidgeted with his collar throughout our initial consultation, and I observed him repeatedly touching his throat in what appeared to be an unconscious gesture. "Dr. Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone developed through decades of courtroom practice. "I understand you employ some manner of historical photographic technique. My colleague Judge Reynolds spoke highly of the portrait you created for him." "Indeed, Your Honor." The daguerreotype process offers a level of authenticity and permanence that modern photography cannot match. Each plate is unique, irreproducible, capturing not merely appearance, but essence. I had begun to phrase my explanations in increasingly metaphysical terms, finding that such language better conveyed the profound nature of what I accomplished. As I prepared the chemical baths, I noticed that the metallic taste in my mouth had intensified over recent days. Dr. Stevens had suggested reducing my exposure to chemical vapors, but such advice demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of artistic necessity. The communion between photographer and chemicals is essential to the process. One cannot create authentic daguerreotypes while maintaining clinical distance from the materials involved. Judge Morrison's sitting proceeded normally, though I observed him struggling more than most subjects to maintain the required stillness. His hand repeatedly moved toward his throat, and I was compelled to remind him several times of the necessity for absolute motionlessness. During the 18th minute of exposure, I experienced another of those increasingly frequent episodes where the studio seemed to shimmer with mercurial vapors. Through this haze, Judge Morrison's appearance seemed subtly altered, his throat bearing marks that suggested constriction, strangulation. The impression lasted only moments, yet it remained vivid in my memory as I completed the exposure. The developing process for Judge Morrison's plate revealed details that confirmed my growing understanding of the daguerreotype's revelatory power. Where his throat should have appeared normal, the silver surface showed clear evidence of rope marks, indentations and discoloration consistent with hanging or strangulation. The marks were not visible to my naked eye during the sitting, yet they appeared with undeniable clarity on the developed plate. My research into Judge Morrison's background proved equally enlightening. Court records, accessible through legal databases I maintain access to despite my departure from academia, revealed a pattern of harsh sentencing that had generated considerable controversy. Most significant was the case of Marcus Thompson, a young man convicted of drug possession, whom Judge Morrison sentenced to 15 years, despite the defendant's lack of prior convictions. Thompson had died in prison 3 months ago under circumstances his family described as suspicious. Thompson's sister, Maria, had publicly accused Judge Morrison of accepting bribes to ensure harsh sentences that would benefit private prison corporations. Her allegations, while unproven, had gained sufficient traction to prompt an ethics investigation. Maria Thompson herself had died just 2 weeks prior, an apparent suicide by hanging, though her family insisted she had shown no signs of depression. The daguerreotype, it appeared, had captured evidence of Judge Morrison's moral culpability in ways that conventional investigation could not. The rope marks visible on the silver plate seemed to represent not physical injury, but spiritual scarring, the metaphysical residue of deaths he had caused through judicial corruption. I find myself compelled to maintain detailed records of these revelations. My journal has become a repository not merely of artistic observations, but of moral documentation that may prove historically significant. Each daguerreotype represents a form of divine justice, revealing truths that human law cannot penetrate. This morning brought my third appointment. Dr. Patricia Webb, a prominent physician whose clientele includes many of Baltimore's social elite. Dr. Webb arrived with the confidence characteristic of medical professionals, though I detected an underlying nervousness that seemed at odds with her composed exterior. "Dr. Blackwood," she said, removing her coat to reveal an elegant dress that spoke of substantial personal wealth. "I must admit to curiosity regarding your methods. As a physician, I'm naturally interested in the scientific aspects of historical photographic processes." Her medical background prompted me to discuss the chemical aspects of daguerreotype creation in greater detail than usual. The process involves a fascinating interplay of silver halides and mercury amalgamation, I explained while preparing the iodine sensitization. The mercury vapor forms a direct bond with exposed silver particles, creating an image of extraordinary permanence and clarity. Dr. Webb observed my preparations with professional interest, though I noted her particular attention to the mercury heating apparatus. "That seems like a substantial amount of mercury vapor," she commented. "Are you concerned about exposure risks?" "One cannot create authentic art while cowering from its demands," I replied, adjusting the flame to achieve optimal mercury vaporization. The Renaissance masters accepted the risks of lead-based pigments. I accept the minor hazards of working with mercury. During Dr. Webb's exposure, I experienced the most intense episode yet of what I had begun to consider enhanced perception. The studio filled with silvery haze that seemed almost tangible, and through it, I observed Dr. Webb's lips bearing traces of a greenish discoloration that suggested metallic poisoning. The vision was extraordinarily vivid, lasting nearly 5 minutes before clearing. The developed daguerreotype confirmed my perception with disturbing accuracy. Dr. Webb's lips, which had appeared normal during the sitting, showed clear evidence of poisoning, specifically the greenish tint characteristic of arsenic exposure. More troubling was the pattern of discoloration, which suggested not accidental exposure but deliberate ingestion or administration. My investigation into Dr. Webb's practice revealed a pattern of wealthy elderly patients who had died under her care, each leaving substantial bequests to various charities that, upon closer examination, proved to be controlled by Dr. Webb herself. The deaths, while attributed to natural causes, had occurred with suspicious frequency among patients who had recently updated their wills. Mrs. Elizabeth Crawford, 93, had died of heart failure just 6 days after naming Dr. Webb's charity as the primary beneficiary of her estate. Mr. James Norton, 87, had succumbed to respiratory complications within a week of signing similar documents. In each case, Dr. Webb had been the attending physician, and autopsies had been deemed unnecessary due to the patient's advanced age. The arsenic traces revealed by the daguerreotype suggested Dr. Webb's method of hastening these conveniently timed deaths. Arsenic, while detectable in sufficient quantities, can mimic natural aging processes when administered in smaller doses over time, a fact that would be well known to a physician of Dr. Webb's experience. I have begun to understand that my daguerreotypes are accomplishing something far more significant than mere portraiture. They are revealing moral truths that conventional investigation cannot uncover, providing evidence of crimes that have escaped human justice. The silver and mercury, properly combined and reverently employed, create a medium capable of perceiving the spiritual residue of guilt and corruption. The physical demands of this work have begun to manifest more prominently. My hands now exhibit a persistent tremor that makes precise chemical measurements increasingly challenging. The metallic taste has become constant, accompanied by occasional difficulty in recalling specific details of my sessions. Yesterday, I discovered notes in my own handwriting describing chemical modifications I had no memory of implementing. Dr. Stevens, during my most recent consultation, expressed concern about what he termed occupational mercury exposure. He prescribed chelation therapy and strongly recommended reducing my contact with quicksilver. Such suggestions demonstrate a fundamental failure to understand the nature of authentic artistic achievement. The great masters throughout history have accepted physical sacrifice in pursuit of transcendent art. Caravaggio's lead poisoning, Van Gogh's neurological deterioration, these were the prices paid for creative revelation. My work transcends mere photography. It represents a form of moral archaeology, excavating hidden truths from the spiritual residue that clings to human souls. Each daguerreotype becomes a confession extracted not through human interrogation, but through chemical revelation. The silver emulsion, sensitized by iodine and developed through mercury vapor, perceives guilt with greater accuracy than any human tribunal. I have scheduled additional sessions throughout the coming weeks, drawn by an increasing urgency to document the moral corruption that permeates Baltimore's social elite. Each portrait reveals new evidence of crimes unpunished and justice denied. The daguerreotype process has become my instrument of divine revelation, and I find myself merely its humble servant. The tremor in my hands grows more pronounced with each passing day, yet my vision seems to grow clearer. Through the silver mirror of mercury-developed plates, I perceive truths that will reshape our understanding of human nature itself. I have begun to modify my chemical formulations, increasing mercury concentrations to enhance the revelatory properties of the process. The results are remarkable. Each new daguerreotype shows moral corruption with ever greater clarity. Tonight, as I review my notes and prepare for tomorrow's sessions, I find myself wondering what other secrets await discovery. The silver calls to me, and I must answer. There are truths yet to be revealed, justice yet to be served through the alchemy of light and mercury. Chapter 3. The Moral Eye. From the Journal of Dr. Marcus Blackwood, October 25, 2024. The transformations within my studio have accelerated beyond my most optimistic expectations. Each daguerreotype session now reveals moral truths with such clarity that I am compelled to acknowledge my role as an instrument of divine justice. The silver and mercury speak to me with increasing eloquence, their chemical voices growing stronger as I refine my techniques toward ever greater revelatory power. This morning's appointment brought Mr. Anthony Chen, a prominent businessman whose import enterprises have made him one of Baltimore's wealthiest residents. Chen arrived precisely on schedule, displaying the punctuality that characterizes successful entrepreneurs, though I observed immediately the nervous energy that seemed to emanate from his very being. His hands, meticulously manicured and adorned with an expensive watch, never remained still throughout our preliminary consultation. "Dr. Blackwood," he said, his accent bearing traces of his Hong Kong origins despite decades of American residence, "my colleague Mrs. Patterson spoke most enthusiastically about your artistic process. I confess to skepticism regarding historical photography methods, but her portrait was remarkably revealing." I found his choice of words prophetic. The daguerreotype process reveals truths that conventional photography cannot perceive, Mr. Chen. The silver emulsion, when properly sensitized and developed through mercury amalgamation, captures not merely physical appearance, but moral essence itself. As I prepared the chemical baths with the enhanced formulations I had recently developed, I noted that my movements had acquired an almost ritualistic precision. The tremor in my hands, while more pronounced during periods of rest, seemed to disappear entirely when I worked with the sacred chemicals. It was as though the mercury and silver guided my movements, ensuring perfect preparation of their revelatory medium. The iodine sensitization proceeded with exceptional results. I had discovered that slightly extended exposure to iodine vapors, combined with elevated temperatures, produced silver halide formations of extraordinary sensitivity. The plate gleamed with an almost supernatural luminescence as I transferred it to the camera, its surface seeming to pulse with anticipation of the truths it would soon capture. Mr. Chen's positioning required several adjustments. His tendency toward constant motion made the extended stillness of daguerreotype exposure particularly challenging. Yet I found myself possessed of unusual patience as I coached him toward the necessary immobility. During these preparations, I began to notice subtle details about his appearance that had not been immediately apparent. A certain darkness beneath his fingernails that suggested recent contact with substances of questionable origin. "The exposure will require complete stillness for approximately 25 minutes, I informed him, having recently extended exposure times to enhance the revelatory properties of the process. During this period, I encourage you to enter a state of meditation, allowing your true nature to emerge for the silver's perception." As the exposure commenced, I found myself entering that enhanced state of awareness that had become increasingly common during my sessions. The studio atmosphere seemed to thicken with mercurial vapors, creating a silvery haze through which ordinary reality appeared transformed. Through this luminous fog, Mr. Chen's hands became the focus of my heightened perception. The darkness beneath his nails seemed to spread and intensify, taking on the unmistakable appearance of dried blood. More disturbing was the gradual revelation of what appeared to be currency, blood-stained bills clutched in his supposedly empty palms. The vision lasted nearly 10 minutes, during which time I felt myself transported into a realm where moral truth manifested as physical reality. When the silvery haze finally cleared, Mr. Chen appeared normal once again, his hands empty and properly positioned. Yet the images I had perceived remained vivid in my consciousness, awaiting confirmation through the developing process. The mercury development of Mr. Chen's plate proceeded with remarkable results. My enhanced chemical formulations, incorporating higher mercury concentrations and elevated temperatures, produced an image of unprecedented clarity and depth. The daguerreotype surface seemed almost to glow with internal light as the mercury amalgamated with the exposed silver particles. What the plate revealed exceeded even my expectations. Mr. Chen's hands showed unmistakable evidence of both blood and currency, the bills clearly visible in his grasp, despite his empty hands during the actual sitting. More significantly, the serial numbers on several bills were legible under magnification, suggesting a level of detail that transcended normal photographic capability. My subsequent investigation into Mr. Chen's business practices revealed correlations that confirmed the daguerreotype's revelations. Maritime import records, accessible through customs databases I had learned to navigate during my academic research, showed a pattern of suspicious cargo manifests from Chen's shipping operations. Missing persons reports from Baltimore's immigrant communities described individuals who had sought employment with Chen's companies and subsequently disappeared. Most illuminating was my discovery of Detective Morrison's case files, the same Detective Morrison whose initial response had documented the suspicious circumstances of Harold Harrington's death. Chen's name appeared repeatedly in connection with human trafficking investigations, though insufficient evidence had prevented prosecution. The blood-stained currency revealed in his daguerreotype suggested payment for services that demanded human lives as collateral. I have begun to recognize that my role extends beyond mere documentation of moral corruption. The daguerreotypes serve as evidence of crimes that conventional investigation cannot uncover, providing proof of guilt that transcends legal technicalities. Each plate becomes a confession extracted through chemical revelation rather than human interrogation. The physical demands of this enhanced work have intensified correspondingly. Yesterday, I discovered myself in the developing chamber with no memory of entering it. Surrounded by completed daguerreotypes I could not recall creating. The plates showed images of remarkable quality, yet the subjects depicted were unfamiliar to me. My appointment calendar showed no record of the sessions, suggesting that my work continues even during periods of unconscious activity. Dr. Stevens has become increasingly insistent regarding what he terms severe mercury toxicity. His latest blood tests revealed mercury levels that he described as potentially fatal, accompanied by recommendations for immediate hospitalization and aggressive chelation therapy. Such alarmist responses demonstrate his failure to comprehend the transcendent nature of my artistic mission. The mercury does not poison me, it enlightens me, granting perceptions that ordinary consciousness cannot achieve. I have begun to notice temporal anomalies during my sessions. What I experience as 25-minute exposures appear to require several hours according to the studio clocks. My subjects seem to enter states of profound stillness that surpass normal human capability, remaining motionless for periods that should be physiologically impossible. Yet they emerge from these sessions with no awareness of the extended duration, describing the experience as unusually peaceful and meditative. The newspaper clippings I have collected document a disturbing pattern among my portrait subjects. Mrs. Harrington was found dead in her home 3 days after our session. The apparent victim of a heart attack, though neighbors reported seeing no ambulance or emergency personnel. Judge Morrison suffered a fatal stroke in his chambers, discovered only when court personnel noticed his absence from scheduled proceedings. Dr. Webb died in her clinic under circumstances her staff described as sudden and unexpected. Each death occurred within 72 hours of their daguerreotype session, suggesting a correlation that transcends mere coincidence. Yet I find myself unable to recall the specific details of these sessions beyond the revelations captured in their portraits. The enhanced mercury formulations appear to affect my own memory, even as they increase the revelatory power of the photographic process. My research into the metaphysical properties of mercury has revealed historical precedents for its use in divine revelation. Alchemical texts describe quicksilver as the medium through which spiritual truth manifests in physical reality. The combination of silver's purifying properties with mercury's transformative power creates a substance capable of perceiving moral essence invisible to ordinary perception. I have modified my chemical apparatus to achieve even greater mercury concentrations, installing additional heating elements and vapor circulation systems that maintain optimal atmospheric conditions throughout the studio. The metallic taste has evolved into something approaching euphoria, a constant awareness of the divine presence that guides my work. My hands have developed a silvery tinge that reflects the profound communion I have achieved with the revelatory elements. The tremor that once concerned me has transformed into a form of inspired movement, my fingers dancing across chemical controls with supernatural precision. I find myself working for hours without fatigue, my consciousness merged with the mercury vapors that permeate every aspect of the studio environment. The boundary between photographer and photograph, between observer and observed, has dissolved into a unity of purpose that transcends individual identity. Tonight's review of my completed daguerreotypes reveals a gallery of moral corruption that spans Baltimore's social and professional elite. Each plate documents crimes that human law has failed to address, providing evidence of guilt that demands divine justice. The silver surfaces seem to pulse with accumulated truth, their mirror-like depths reflecting not physical forms, but the spiritual essence of human evil. I have begun to understand that the deaths following each session represent not coincidence, but consequence. The daguerreotype process does not merely reveal moral corruption, it purifies it through mercurial transformation. My subjects, confronted with the truth of their own nature, captured in silver and mercury, experience a form of chemical judgment that transcends human tribunals. The studio has become a temple of revelation, where truth manifests through alchemical processes older than human law. I am merely the humble servant of forces that operate according to principles of cosmic justice. Each daguerreotype session brings me closer to complete union with the divine elements that guide my work. Tomorrow brings new appointments, new opportunities for revelation and purification. The silver calls to me with increasing urgency, and I must answer. There are truths yet to be captured, justice yet to be administered through the sacred marriage of light and mercury. My hands may tremble with mortal weakness, but my vision grows ever clearer as I approach perfect communion with the revelatory darkness that dwells within silver's luminous depths. From the Journal of Dr. Marcus Blackwood, November 2nd, 2024, the revelation came through technology I had installed purely for security purposes. A digital recording system positioned to monitor my studio during those increasingly frequent periods when my consciousness merges so completely with the mercurial vapors that linear time becomes meaningless. What I discovered upon reviewing this footage has shattered the comfortable boundaries between divine revelation and earthly reality, forcing me to confront truths that my mercury-enlightened perception had previously interpreted through more transcendent frameworks. The recordings reveal sessions of extraordinary duration, not the 25 minutes I recall experiencing, but periods extending 6 to 8 hours. More disturbing is the state of my subjects during these extended exposures. What I had perceived as profound meditative stillness appears, through the unforgiving eye of digital surveillance, as something far more troubling. My subjects remain motionless, not through spiritual discipline, but through a stillness that suggests cessation. Mr. Anthony Chen's session, which I recalled as a routine 40-minute appointment, actually began at 2:15 p.m. and concluded at 9:47 p.m., according to the digital timestamp. The footage shows my subject maintaining perfect stillness throughout this impossible duration, his chest rising and falling with decreasing frequency until, sometime during the 4th hour, all movements ceased entirely. Yet I continued the session for 3 additional hours, adjusting mercury concentrations and exposure settings with the methodical precision of one completely absorbed in sacred work. The implications disturb me profoundly. If the digital record accurately represents temporal reality, and I must acknowledge the possibility that my mercury-enhanced consciousness experiences time according to different principles than conventional measurement, then my daguerreotype sessions involve processes that transcend normal photographic practice. The revelation that my subjects enter states indistinguishable from death during these extended exposures suggests that the purification I believe to occur after their sessions actually manifests during the photographic process itself. I have spent considerable time analyzing the security footage, searching for evidence that might explain these temporal distortions. During the extended sessions, my own behavior appears altered. I move through the studio with mechanical precision, adjusting chemical concentrations and exposure settings according to patterns I cannot consciously recall learning. My face, when visible in the recordings, bears an expression of profound concentration that borders on the ecstatic, as though I am experiencing revelations invisible to the recording equipment. Most unsettling is the discovery of additional footage showing sessions I have no conscious memory of conducting. The recordings reveal numerous subjects, men and women of various ages, all dressed in the formal attire appropriate for portrait photography, undergoing the same extended exposure process. Yet my appointment calendar contains no record of these sessions, and I possess no daguerreotypes documenting their completion. The basement of my studio, accessible through a door I had previously assumed led to building utilities, contains evidence that challenges my understanding of my own activities. 12 bodies, arranged in precise formation, as those still posing for daguerreotypes, occupy the space in various stages of preservation. The mercury vapors that permeate the studio appear to have created a form of chemical mummification, maintaining the bodies in conditions that suggest recent death, despite what must be considerably longer exposure to the preservative atmosphere. Each corpse displays the distinctive silver discoloration that characterizes prolonged mercury exposure, their skin bearing the metallic sheen I have begun to notice on my own hands and face. More significantly, each body shows evidence of the prolonged stillness required for daguerreotype exposure, muscular rigidity and facial expressions frozen in the peaceful repose I associate with successful portrait sessions. My chemical equipment, upon closer examination, reveals modifications I cannot recall implementing. The mercury heating apparatus now incorporates additional vaporization chambers capable of maintaining atmospheric mercury concentrations far exceeding levels necessary for photographic development. Safety interlocks that should prevent dangerous vapor accumulation have been bypassed through electrical modifications that demonstrate considerable technical sophistication, knowledge I do not consciously possess. The appointment calendar on my desk, written in my own handwriting, documents sessions with individuals whose names I do not recognize. Detective Sarah Morrison appears scheduled for tomorrow's session, though I have no memory of arranging this appointment. The notation beside her name reads, "Final exposure, complete revelation expected," written in script that appears increasingly erratic compared to my earlier entries. Dr. Stevens's medical reports, discovered among papers I do not recall receiving, describe mercury blood levels approaching lethal concentrations. His notes indicate severe neurological impairment, complete memory fragmentation and probable psychotic episodes associated with heavy metal poisoning. He has apparently attempted to contact me repeatedly regarding emergency hospitalization. Though I possess no memory of these communications, the daguerreotypes themselves, when examined under intense magnification, reveal details that challenge my interpretation of their revelatory nature. The blood I perceived on Mrs. Harrington's gloves appears, upon closer analysis, to be actual blood, not supernatural revelation, but physical evidence captured through normal photographic processes. Similarly, the rope marks on Judge Morrison's throat and the arsenic traces around Dr. Webb's lips represent genuine physical manifestations rather than spiritual revelations. The horrifying possibility emerges that my subjects exhibited these signs of violence not as moral revelations captured by enhanced daguerreotype sensitivity, but as evidence of actual injuries sustained during their sessions. The blood, the strangulation marks, the poison traces, all suggest forms of violence occurring during the extended exposures I cannot fully remember. My journal entries from recent weeks, when read in sequence, reveal disturbing gaps and inconsistencies. Entire days appear to be missing from my record, replaced by chemical formulas and photographic notations written in handwriting that grows increasingly illegible. The elegant prose I pride myself on devolves into fragmentary observations about mercury communion and silver purification that suggest a mind operating according to principles far removed from rational discourse. The newspaper clippings documenting my subjects' deaths take on new significance when viewed alongside the security footage. Each death is reported to have occurred at their respective residences, yet the timing coincides precisely with their departure from my studio following sessions that appear to have lasted far longer than reported. The possibility that these individuals never actually left my studio alive creates implications I struggle to fully comprehend. Physical evidence throughout the studio supports conclusions I am reluctant to acknowledge. Blood traces, barely visible to normal inspection, but clearly apparent under ultraviolet illumination, I had installed for examining daguerreotype plates, mark pathways between the camera station and the basement. Chemical analysis equipment, apparently acquired during periods I cannot recall, contains residues of substances including arsenic, strychnine, and concentrated mercury compounds, materials that suggest activities extending far beyond photographic artistry. My own physical condition provides additional evidence of prolonged mercury exposure beyond any reasonable photographic necessity. The silvery discoloration of my skin, initially subtle, has progressed to obvious metallic pigmentation, visible even in normal lighting. My hands, when examined closely, show the distinctive tremor and muscular rigidity associated with severe neurological mercury poisoning. Most alarming is the gradual loss of feeling in my extremities, suggesting nerve damage that may be irreversible. The enhancement of my chemical formulations, documented in notebooks filled with increasingly erratic calculations, reveals a progression toward mercury concentrations that would be immediately fatal to anyone exposed for extended periods. My notations describe these modifications as necessary for complete revelatory purification, though the actual effect would be rapid death through mercury vapor inhalation. Detective Morrison's investigation files, somehow acquired and stored in my studio filing system, document missing persons cases that correspond precisely with the individuals whose bodies occupy my basement. 12 prominent Baltimore residents, all wealthy and socially connected, disappeared over the past 6 months, following what their families described as portrait photography appointments. Detective Morrison's notes indicate her growing suspicion that these disappearances share a common connection, a suspicion that appears to have led to her scheduling tomorrow's appointment. The daguerreotype plates themselves, when subjected to chemical analysis, contain mercury concentrations sufficient to cause death through dermal contact alone. The enhanced revelatory properties I believed I was achieving actually represent the creation of photographic plates so thoroughly saturated with toxic mercury that mere handling would constitute fatal exposure. My subjects, required to remain motionless during the extended developing process, were essentially undergoing mercury poisoning in real time while posing for their portraits. My studio has become not a temple of divine revelation, but a chamber of systematic murder disguised as artistic practice. The mercury vapors I believed granted me supernatural perception have instead created a state of neurological damage so severe that I have been unconsciously conducting and concealing multiple homicides while constructing elaborate spiritual justifications for my actions. Tomorrow's appointment with Detective Morrison represents either an opportunity for revelation of a different sort, the exposure of my unconscious crimes, or the completion of a pattern that my mercury-poisoned consciousness apparently feels compelled to continue. The notation in my calendar suggests that some part of my mind recognizes her true identity and purpose, even as my conscious awareness remains fragmented by chemical brain damage. I find myself unable to determine whether I should attempt to prevent tomorrow's session or allow events to proceed according to whatever pattern my unconscious mind has established. The mercury continues to sing its silvery song of purification and truth, yet the security footage and physical evidence suggest that this truth involves activities my rational mind finds abhorrent. The boundary between divine revelation and chemical madness has dissolved entirely, leaving me suspended between conflicting interpretations of reality that may be equally valid or equally delusional. Tomorrow will determine whether Detective Morrison's investigation concludes with justice or merely adds another daguerreotype to my gallery of preserved moral purification. From the Journal of Dr. Marcus Blackwood, November 3rd, 2024. The appointment hour approaches with the inevitability of chemical reaction, one element meeting another in proportions that will determine whether synthesis or explosion results. Detective Morrison is scheduled to arrive at precisely 2 p.m., though I find myself unable to recall the circumstances of this arrangement or the identity behind the carefully scripted notation in my appointment calendar. The handwriting appears increasingly foreign to me, as though some other consciousness has been maintaining my professional obligations, while my mercury-enlightened awareness dwells in realms beyond mundane scheduling. I have spent the morning in preparation, though I cannot determine whether I am preparing for a routine portrait session or something altogether more significant. The chemical apparatus responds to my touch with familiar precision, yet I observe my movements as though watching a stranger perform rituals whose meaning has become obscure. My hands, now bearing the distinctive silver patina of prolonged mercury communion, move across the controls with supernatural fluency, while my conscious mind struggles to comprehend their purpose. The studio atmosphere has achieved a density of mercurial vapor that transforms ordinary light into something approaching liquid silver. Each breath carries the metallic essence that has become more essential to my existence than common air. I find myself moving through this luminous haze with increasing difficulty, distinguishing between memory and immediate experience, between the documented evidence of my activities and the transcendent interpretations my consciousness provides. At 2:03 p.m., my client arrives. Detective Sarah Morrison presents herself with the professional composure characteristic of law enforcement. though I detect an underlying tension that suggests purposes beyond conventional portrait photography. Her appearance, approximately 35 years of age, auburn hair arranged in a practical style, clothing that suggests both authority and readiness for physical action, creates an impression of controlled competence that I find simultaneously admirable and oddly threatening. "Dr. Blackwood," she says, her voice carrying undertones of careful evaluation, "I appreciate you accommodating such short notice for this appointment. I understand you specialize in historical photographic techniques." "Indeed," I reply, though my voice sounds distant to my own ears, as though emerging from the depths of mercury vapor that fills my consciousness. The daguerreotype process offers revelations impossible through conventional photography. Each plate captures not merely appearance, but essence, truth that transcends surface observation. Detective Morrison nods with apparent understanding, though I observe her eyes conducting a systematic examination of the studio environment. Her gaze lingers on the chemical apparatus, the mercury heating systems, the peculiar discoloration that has begun to affect all metallic surfaces within the space. I wonder what conclusions her trained observation might draw from details that have become invisible to my mercury-adapted perception. "I'm particularly interested in authenticity," she continues, removing her coat to reveal a shoulder holster that she makes no attempt to conceal. "I've heard that your daguerreotypes reveal hidden aspects of your subjects that ordinary photography might miss." Her words suggest knowledge that extends beyond casual curiosity about historical photographic methods. Yet I find myself unable to determine whether this represents genuine artistic interest or something more investigative in nature. The mercury vapors have begun to create that familiar sensation of enhanced awareness, though the revelations they provide seem increasingly unreliable when compared to documented evidence. As I begin the chemical preparation ritual, Detective Morrison observes with professional attention that differs markedly from the casual curiosity exhibited by previous subjects. Her questions about mercury concentrations, exposure duration, and ventilation systems suggest familiarity with industrial safety protocols that typical portrait clients would not possess. Yet my mercury-enhanced consciousness interprets her inquiries as evidence of deep appreciation for the transcendent aspects of authentic photographic artistry. "The process requires extended stillness," I explain, while adjusting mercury vapor levels to optimal concentration. "Typically, 25 to 30 minutes of absolute motionlessness, during which the silver captures your essential nature. Some subjects find the experience transformative." "How many subjects have you photographed using this technique?" Detective Morrison asks, positioning herself near the camera while maintaining clear sightlines to the studio exit. The question penetrates the mercurial haze surrounding my consciousness, forcing me to confront numerical realities that my enhanced awareness had interpreted in more spiritual terms. "Numerous portraits over recent months," I reply, though specific counts elude my mercury-fragmented memory. Each session represents a unique revelation of moral truth invisible to conventional perception. The iodine sensitization proceeds with unusual difficulty. My hands, despite their supernatural precision in chemical manipulation, exhibit tremors that interfere with the delicate plate preparation. Detective Morrison observes these symptoms with obvious concern, though she maintains the composed demeanor appropriate to a portrait subject preparing for an artistic session. "Dr. Blackwood," she says quietly, "are you feeling well? You appear to be experiencing some physical distress." Her observation forces me to acknowledge symptoms I had interpreted as evidence of advancing spiritual communion with the revelatory elements. The tremor, the metallic taste, the periods of temporal displacement. Viewed through her concerned evaluation, these manifestations suggest medical emergency rather than transcendent artistic achievement. The demands of authentic artistry require certain sacrifices, I explain, though my voice lacks the conviction that previously accompanied such statements. The great masters throughout history accepted physical consequences in pursuit of higher truth. The mercury heating system achieves optimal vaporization as Detective Morrison takes her position before the camera. Yet something in her posture suggests readiness for action rather than the passive acceptance typical of portrait subjects. Her hand remains within easy reach of her weapon, and her eyes continue scanning the studio environment with tactical awareness. The exposure begins, and with it comes the most intense episode of mercury-enhanced perception I have yet experienced. The studio fills with silver light so brilliant that ordinary vision becomes impossible, replaced by awareness that operates according to principles beyond normal sensory function. Through this luminous haze, Detective Morrison's true nature becomes visible with shocking clarity. She bears no signs of moral corruption. No bloodstains mark her hands. No evidence of guilt mars her spiritual essence. Instead, her presence seems to radiate the purity of genuine justice, not the cosmic vengeance I had believed myself to be administering, but authentic moral authority founded on truth and legal responsibility. The revelation terrifies me in ways that no previous daguerreotype session has accomplished. For the first time, the silver shows me not hidden guilt, but innocence confronting genuine evil. Detective Morrison represents not another subject for purification, but the instrument through which my own actions will face judgment. The mercury vapors that had granted me supernatural perception now reveal the horrifying truth of my own moral corruption. The vision intensifies beyond endurance. Through the silver haze, I perceive my studio as it truly exists, not a temple of divine revelation, but a chamber of systematic murder. The chemical apparatus that I had believed enhanced the spiritual properties of daguerreotype photography appears as instruments of death, designed to kill through mercury poisoning, while my damaged consciousness created elaborate justifications for serial homicide. Detective Morrison's investigation files materialize in the mercurial light, their contents becoming visible with supernatural clarity. 12 missing persons, all last seen entering my studio for portrait appointments. Forensic evidence linking their disappearances to mercury poisoning. Witness testimony describing my increasingly erratic behavior over recent months. A warrant for my arrest that she carries with her into this final session. The mercury concentration in the studio atmosphere has reached levels that would prove immediately fatal to anyone with normal physiology. Yet Detective Morrison continues breathing normally, protected by equipment I had not consciously noticed. A concealed respirator system that allows her to function in the toxic environment I have created. Her presence represents not spiritual revelation, but law enforcement prepared for encounter with a mercury-poisoned serial killer. My consciousness fragments under the weight of simultaneous realities. The mercury-enhanced perception that had granted me access to divine justice collapses into recognition of chemical madness. The spiritual purification I believed I was administering to corrupt subjects reveals itself as murder committed by a mind so damaged by heavy metal poisoning that it could no longer distinguish between transcendent mission and criminal insanity. Detective Morrison rises from her position, her movement fluid and controlled despite the toxic atmosphere. Dr. Marcus Blackwood, she says, her voice penetrating the silver haze with legal authority. You are under arrest for the murders of 12 individuals. You have the right to remain silent." The words continue, but my hearing has become unreliable as the mercury concentration reaches critical levels. My own breathing grows labored as the vapors that had sustained my enhanced consciousness finally achieve concentrations toxic even to my adapted physiology. The chemical communion that had granted me supernatural awareness becomes the instrument of my own destruction. I attempt to reach the mercury heating controls. Whether to reduce the lethal concentrations or to increase them beyond any possibility of survival, I cannot determine. My silver-stained hands respond sluggishly to conscious direction, the neurological damage from months of mercury exposure finally overwhelming my motor functions. Detective Morrison speaks into a radio device, calling for backup and medical emergency response. Her words seem to echo from vast distances as my consciousness retreats into the mercurial depths that have been my refuge from mundane reality. The studio that had been my temple of revelation becomes the scene of final judgment, not the cosmic justice I had believed myself to be administering, but earthly accountability for crimes committed in the depths of chemical madness. The daguerreotype camera, positioned to capture Detective Morrison's portrait, continues its extended exposure as my body succumbs to mercury concentrations that exceed any possibility of survival. My final act of artistic creation will document not moral corruption requiring purification, but justice confronting the evil that mercury-enhanced delusion had prevented me from recognizing in myself. The silver plate, when eventually developed, will show only an empty chair where my consciousness should have been. The final revelation that authentic moral truth had been present all along in the absence rather than the presence of the photographer who believed himself capable of perceiving divine justice through chemical means. Final entry found written in increasingly illegible script across multiple pages, apparently composed during Dr. Blackwood's final mercury exposure. Chemical analysis of the ink reveals mercury concentrations sufficient to cause death through dermal absorption alone.